All right, so let's talk a little bit about emotions and whether or not human emotions are culturally universal. We often think about emotions as being a product of biology or a product of our brain chemistry, but we really don't think about them as being culturally variable or something. We tend to think that everybody feels the same in other cultures. Do people from different cultures recognize and categorize emotions in the same way as us, though? Do people from different cultures all associate the same basic to facial expressions, body language, and tone of voice with the same corresponding emotional state? Well, there's a lot of research out there that says that's not necessarily accurate. There are a few human basic universals in terms of emotions. So things like joy, sadness, fear, disgust, contempt, anger. There are some basic emotions that humans, if you show a Chinese person a face of an American person looking sad, the Chinese person will say that's a sad face, and you show that same face to Australian Aboriginal and an Alaskan Native, all these different people, they'll say that's a sad looking person. So there do appear to be some pretty universal facial expressions and possibly emotions that all human beings share. However, many societies and cultures have culturally specific emotions, and since this class is called Love, Sex, and Globalization, you probably understand where I'm going with this argument. So many cultures have a very different conception of what love is. We're starting to finally talk about love in this class. Um, yeah, and love is not this more simplistic emotion like you might think of like anger, sadness, happiness. Love is complicated, and so there's a lot more cultural variability in love than there are in other emotions. So I'd like to talk about this group of people called the Ifaluk. Let me move my face down there. That's good. The Ifaluk. And this anthropologist went and studied the Ifaluk, who live on a Micronesian atoll. So if you don't know what a coral atoll is, this is what it looks like. Whereas most islands in the ocean are the product of a volcano erupting or something like that. They look like the Hawaiian Islands, the stereotypical sort of mountain that formed and a volcano erupt, and they're built like this. Coral atolls are built up over thousands and millions of years from coral simply growing and rising up like this. And so you end up with this flat as a pancake kind of island that never gets very far above sea level. In fact, most of our coral atolls will probably be lost in your and my lifetimes because of climate change, because they're just so close to the same level with the ocean. And for a lot of reasons, coral atolls are very tough places to live. Tsunamis, storms, and things like that can wipe out entire percentages of the population really easy. And this anthropologist who studied the people called Ifaluk, who live on this Micronesian coral atoll, found that they don't have a direct translation for the word love as we use the word love in English. So they have a word that means fago. That means sort of a combination of what we might think of as compassion, love, but also sadness. We typically don't imagine that sadness is part of love. So this is a direct quote from Lutz, who is the anthropologist in this study. Fago speaks to the sense that life is fragile, that connections to others are precious, and may be severed through death or travel, that love may equal loss. Fago is uttered in recognition of the suffering that is everywhere and in the spirit of vigorous optimism that human efforts, most especially in the form of caring for others, can control its ravages. So you can imagine where a storm might wipe out half the island. It might take away all the buildings and destroy all the chickens and pigs and farms that people were growing. And those people that year would have to rely on the other side of the island for food and shelter. And you'd have to have enormous amounts of love, sadness, and compassion and all these different emotions to take care of those people, because the next year, by pure chance, it could be your side of the island that gets wiped away, and then you have to be the one that go to them for help. And so because of this very specific environmental not creation, but this environment that these people live in, they have a totally different relationship to what love is and what is entailed in love. And it's very different than ours, where we tend to associate with love with romantic passion, which we'll be talking about differently. So why don't I open that up to you? Why do you think that the Ifaluk feel Fago? I've mentioned that already, so it's not that hard. How do you think it may be different from the American feelings of love? How do you think love is experienced and why it's different than Fago? Oops, there we go. So not only do the Ivaluk imagine that love is different, but so do South Koreans, which I have a lot more expertise in. But this is also changing in South Korea, as we've been talking about globalization, and they got a Taco Bell, so very big cultural shifts there. But for the most part, South Koreans for a very long time used a term that was called yone. Yone in South Korean. And it's been changing. They used yone to mean love, and it tended to be associated with duty, with respect, and a lot of terminology such as that. And it had to do with when Koreans were living in these sorts of uh, complexes where they were extended nuclear families. I'm trying to get my mouse to appear, but it's not. There it is. They would live in these family complexes, which was full of the nuclear family. So it'd be grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren, all living together. Oh, I'm sorry. I just described joint family. I was describing joint family, not nuclear family, excuse me. Grandparents and multi-generational households. And that's how Koreans live for a very long time. That's a very traditional way to live. And they would say yone, that had to do with respect and, again, endearment and the fact that you had responsibilities that you had to fulfill. But as Korea has developed economically and also been more incorporated into the global cultural landscape, they've been exposed to a lot more Western media, and they started replacing yone with a word called sarang. And sarang is what people usually use nowadays to describe a romantic partner. So that changed. I mean, it's a big change. So it changed their meanings in the 1920s to be explicitly about romantic love between a man and a woman, rather than between, in English we say, I love my mother and I love my wife, but we love those people in very different ways. In Korea, they used to love everybody yone, with respect and duty. They used to have arranged marriage, for example, and you didn't know the person, you didn't feel romantic passion for the person, you just married them and you respected them and they were your wife. But now they have romantic love, which is sarang, and they live in nuclear families, just the sort of Western model. So this follows a similar transition from large extended family units to nuclear families. Economic development, technologies, and new technologies precipitated this cultural shift. So there is a really tight connection between economic development, between lifestyle, and the ways that people feel emotions. So you could imagine that the people of the Ivaluk might one day move to the United States, and they may start feeling love in a very different way. So I'd like you to think: will globalization, just like we saw in talking about McDonald's, will globalization cause a homogenization of love? And would that be, wouldn't it be sad if everyone felt love in the same way? Losing that cultural diversity. But do you think globalization will cause a homogenization of love?